Well, hello everyone. My name is Kevin Porman. I'm a developer advocate here at Salesforce, and with me today I have my coworker Alba. Alba, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sorry, there is an echo. I don't know if the audience can hear an echo, but I can.
Okay, let's try that. Does that fix the echo?
Now, yeah.
Great.
Much better. Thank you. Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you so much for watching this codeLive, and thank you, Kevin, for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here because today we are going to be talking about an app in which I've been working the last couple of weeks, and I've learned a lot from building that app, and I'm really excited to talk about it and show it to you.
Cool. So for those of you who are just now tuning in to what codeLive is, it's a weekly thing where we get on, we code live. And in the month of December, another coworker of ours, a guy named Mohith, and I worked on building a travel approval app in Slack and Salesforce. And we had a couple of really big goals for it. We wanted to have per user authentication with all that authentication information stored inside Salesforce, so we knew it was secure. And we also wanted to be able to have communication both ways, so Slack to Salesforce, and to have your approval processes there in Salesforce, and then when those are accomplished in Salesforce, sending it back to Slack. And when we last left our heroes, we had just gotten to the point where we had built the UI inside Slack to put in the travel request. And we've created our, we've got our code base here, and we created our Slack channel and our app here. And all I've done so far is I went in and I logged in, I authenticated. So that's what we've gotten so far. And we're going to pick up from where we left off. But Mo, as it turns out, is on paternity leave, so he is hanging out with his new baby, and we're going to work with this with Alba instead. Alba and Mo worked on it together, but she's never had any of the limelight. So now we're going to put her in the limelight and let her walk us through sort of the final product of Ready to Fly. So we've built a bunch of it live, and now we're going to look at sort of what it looks like completed. And I'm really excited to hear what sort of questions and comments, even snide remarks, you guys have from the chat there. I will point out that I've discovered a bug already that I want to talk about, where the travel requests for user show up. It occurs to me I called that a bug, but that may actually be what my username is. It's not a bug?
Exactly. It's so the setup script creates a scratcher, and the default name for scratchers is user. Yeah, then you have to change your name in the scratcher if you have to get a different name showed.
All right, that's not a bug. That's my bad. How do I? So I've got our Salesforce scratch org that we created here. Oh yeah, here user. So I'm going to do Kevin. I'll do Porman here, and do Kevin, and I'll save this. And I think, how quickly should we expect this to be pulled up inside Slack?
Yeah, you have to refresh. You can do with Command R if you're on Mac.
Yep. Oh, it's cache. Oh, there it is. Look at that. Boom.
Now it is.
Fantastic. I like it. Okay. So we put in the bit last when we left off. We just put in the shortcut to where my shortcuts are not showing up there.
Yeah, you should write, and maybe you write create, and then the shortcut will come up.
Yeah.
That out. No, but you click on plus, and then there you have
there we go. I thought I could click on, I could get to it by clicking on the button there. Okay.
I'm not sure why it doesn't appear. Maybe it's a configuration.
So I'm going to start in Indianapolis, where I'm at. And this is where we left off. We just built this. I'm going to go anywhere warm. So I'm going to say Hawaii. Today end date is the 28th. Leave that. Leave Maria as the approver. And it's too cold here. We're having Winter Storm Landon in Indianapolis, and we are I look out outside my window and we've gotten probably 6 inches of snow. Do you have snow in where you're at, Alba?
Just twice or 3 times a year. Not much.
Cool. So I just put in that travel request. How does this actually work? So we put in the travel request, we send, that data is submitted somewhere. How does that get into Salesforce?
Okay, so first of all, I'm going to show you how to react to that shortcut that you just created. Okay? That you just used, sorry. So here, let me close these tabs because they are not related to the shortcut. Well, you are going to see a folder structure in the app. It's an opinionated folder structure that we have taken from the Slack DevRel team. This is what they are doing and what they are proposing to use. And in Slack, how things work is that you do something in the app, and then a listener that's defined in the Node.js app or the Python app that you have created to respond to those events reacts, right? So in the listeners, we have divided the listeners by the different kind of events that you can have coming from Slack. For instance, actions, generic events, views, and one of them are shortcuts. So what you did in the app is exactly a shortcut, right?
Okay.
So what we did was to create a listener for that shortcut, and that shortcut, all the listeners are defined in this way. It's an async function that receives a number of parameters. Some of the listeners receive an ACK parameter that you need to call within 3 seconds. If not, Slack is going to give you an error. It's just to acknowledge that you have received that event. The client and the context are also in all the kind of events. And then in this special type of event, we have an object, which is the shortcut. So that shortcut has information of how you triggered that shortcut, right? Mm-hmm. And it has an ID. Each shortcut interaction has an ID. So that is something that you need to use to be able to open a modal in response to that shortcut. And what we did, as we are reusing this modal, because we have 2 entry points for the modal, okay? We have the create travel request shortcut entry point, which is the one that you created, but we have a button on the home page that also opens this modal, okay?
And that
so
button
I'm going
is down
to
here, right? This create new travel request button?
Exactly. So we moved that code that at the beginning when Mo created the code, it wasn't in this file, but I moved it to a utils folder because it's something that we are reusing from 2 different listeners and 2 different entry points. And this is basically what we are doing, okay? What we are doing is to create, we fetch first the possible approvers for that travel request that you are creating. We decided to determine those approvers, taking a look at the manager field of the user object, and then we show to you your manager and the manager of your manager. I think it's 2 levels of approval. And then what we do is to open a view. This view is the modal, is the modal that you have shown, the modal that you have created. And what happens is that with this folder structure in which we divide classes with a meaning, right? We have a folder which is user interface, in which we have all our views, right? Or all the visual part of our applications or of the blocks that we are rendering on Slack surfaces. So for instance, if we open the modals folder here, we are going to find the definition for all the modals that we show in the app. And we have a modal which is create travel request form. And this is exactly the way in which you create the model.
And this is
I
just
don't
the
know
block
if-
kit builder NPM module we used. So if you go back to the original 4 episodes, Mo and I used this. We used an NPM plugin. I'm not sure what the right terminology is. I want to call it a gem. But that's the Ruby version. To pull in this ability to sort of declaratively create elements in our modals, etc.
Yeah, it's a plugin called Node Builder. I'm going to Block Builder. Sorry,
Block
I'm
Builder,
going to share the link with Sarah, so that Sarah puts it into the chat window,
Yep.
and so that you can take a look. Okay, so this is the way in which we create the model. Right, we have a series of inputs with all the information that Kevin populated. He wants to go to Hawaii. I want to, but I think it's farther for me. and this model is, let's say, linked with a listener for the view, thanks to this callback ID. Callback ID is a property that you have to set up in the definition of your model, and that it is what Slack is going to call out when the user clicks on the create or save button for submitting that model, right? Okay, so now let's take a look at the second part. Where do we define that listener? Well, again, as we have listeners meaningful divided, here we have a folder, which is the views folder. And this is the listener that we register to respond to the initiate travel request callback ID. How do we do that? Well, we have here an index.js file in which we register all the listeners. If you think about it, this way of registering listeners, in this case, we only have one listener, but if you have many listeners, it's a very a clean way of registering listeners and having in one site all the listeners available, right? For instance, see the listeners for the actions. We have all the listeners in a single file defined, and all the code is divided and well structured, right? So going back to that listener, which is this one here, we register the I want to respond to events that are linked to this callback ID. Executing this listener is defined here in this file in the same folder. And in this case, again, we receive the client and the context, but we also receive a view parameter, which contains all the information that was submitted in the form.
Okay, so that view parameter is going to give us basically a dictionary or hash to pull the data out. So when we look at it here, we've got the view, but then we're going to start pulling out like array indices. So the state indice, and then the value, and then the input origin, and then we have input origin again.
Yeah, exactly. So that is the origin where you are flying from.
And that is, how do we know what name to pull that out of? Like, how do we know it's called input origin instead of origin?
I think it's defined in the definition of the form. Let me see.
Oh, I see. Okay. Action ID.
We have
okay.
an action ID. And there is where we say this is the input that maps to the input origin action ID, and this is how we get that input.
So it looks like they've got the input, and then that is the action ID, and then we also have the block ID. Is that correct? If we go back
I
to
think
our...
so.
Okay. So is it action ID and then block ID, or block ID and then action ID?
I'm not sure because I didn't build this part.
Okay, that's fair. I was just curious.
But you can possibly investigate that.
Okay.
asynchronously. Okay. So what else? So we get all that input from the user. We are able to read what the Slack API has sent to us, to that view listener. And then the next step would be to insert that information in Salesforce, right? So to interact with Salesforce, all the code that we use for that is stored in a dedicated folder called Salesforce, right? Before it was called Salesforce, but we have changed the name. So basically, here we have all the files that are used to perform the authentication. And we have a DML folder and a query folder. And that way we have also the files sorted in a meaningful way. So in this case, what we want to do is to insert a travel request. So it makes sense that the file belongs to the DML folder, right? And the way in which we insert that travel request is by using JSForce, the library that we normally use to interact with Salesforce APIs. And we do all that, authenticate it with the user-to-user flow, and the action is performed on behalf of the user. In your case, Kevin Portman, which was the Slack user, the Salesforce user that you authorized with.
That seems, I want to say it seems straightforward because I conceptually followed you along the way, but I feel like one of the hurdles in learning to do this is making sure that you understand where the various files are and how they're all interrelated. I followed the whole, like, we're going to get the data, create an object out of it, and then pass that into this method here. But getting the sort of files arranged and understanding where things are is going to be, I think it might be a hurdle. I think it would be a hurdle for me if I wasn't doing this on a day-to-day basis. Are there any kind of like scaffolding helpers? I know, like, so in Express or in Rails, there's a, create me a modal window sort of helper. Do we have anything like that?
Well, really what we have is the Salesforce Slack Starter Kit with which we created this app. You were developing that in one of your sessions, right, Kevin?
Yeah. But I don't remember if we ever got to the point where we were building those sort of scaffolding help.
Yeah, so with the Salesforce Slack Starter Kit, you get a scaffolded project like this one.
Okay. Somebody's asking where the code is available to look at. I'm putting in that URL right now. It's Ready to Fly is the name of it.
Yeah, but it's not public, the repo, sorry.
Oh, the repo's not public. Okay. So no, self-made. I'm sorry. The code is not yet available for review, but I do believe we have the GitHub.
We have the Salesforce Slack Starter Kit. We have it public, and we are making this. We are making this app public in next Thursday.
Next Thursday. Okay. So you can use this URL to see the starter kit that we were just talking about that gives you the scaffolding. But the actual completed app that we're looking at and working with today is not yet public. It'll be released next Thursday.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So out of curiosity, here it is. This automatically updated. I put in my travel request, or it's too cold here, and it automatically updated. That's nice.
Mm-hmm.
I like it. Okay.
Yeah. I wanted to add, Kevin, to what you were saying, that I had to take over the job that Mo did. And it's true that at the beginning, I didn't know where to put things. But what we are going to do is, on top of releasing this app, we are going to release a series of blog posts in which I'm documenting very well the structure that we decided to use and which alternatives do you have to create the integration flows and where to put the files in each of the cases.
Gotcha.
So that's would probably help.
Yeah. Okay. Having read those blog posts, or at least some of them, as they're getting ready to come out, I can say they're a treat to read, and I highly encourage people to read them. You can find them on developer.salesforce.com/blogs when they come out. I don't think they come out. The first one doesn't come out till next Thursday either. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
So the first one, together with the app, is coming out next Thursday.
Okay, so we've got our Ready to Fly app. We've shown how we actually wire that in, so we send a new one over. How does it work to approve or to make that work?
So there are several places from which you can approve a travel request. So first of all, if you click on that travel requests to review button on the top,
okay,
there, if you are a manager and there are travel requests for which you are the approver, you are going to see the list of travel requests pending review, and you are able to approve or reject them from within Slack. That's the power of Slack, right? That you don't have to go to Salesforce and multitask to Salesforce or any other page to complete your job, but you can directly within Slack change status of travel requests, or I don't know, submit expenses to approval, right?
Yeah.
So if you click on one of the buttons, Kevin.
I don't think John should go to Paris, so I'm going to reject that one. And then I'll say John can go to Dublin. So approve that.
Okay.
Now, before I move on here, Selfmade, great point. The first URL that we sent, that one, this is Ready to Fly, that is the completed app we're working with today, and it's not yet been released. It won't be released until next Thursday, which I believe, if I'm doing my math right, is the 10th of February.
10th.
But the second one is the starter kit that we built Ready to Fly with. So you can get started playing around with this with the starter kit, but the final completed sample app Ready to Fly isn't yet available. So if I look at my travel requests, it's loaded mine up here. What happens when somebody approves one of these?
So when someone approves a travel request that you have created, you are going to receive a notification. You can try that if you approve travel request from Salesforce.
Can I do that?
Emulating that you are the approver, because you are not, and we all know.
So this says I haven't submitted for approval. I haven't submitted this for approval. How do I need to submit this for approval? No,
for instance, it's submitted to approval. It's just change the status and change it to approve.
Okay.
Right. So now
you see, if you look up here in the corner here, you'll see that I got a little red dot, meaning you got a notification, and I pulled in a message. Hey, check that out! My travel request has been approved. I like that.
Yeah. So that's another interesting flow to take a look at, because most of the flows, for instance, clicking on the button to approve the travel request, or visualizing the travel request that you have assigned, or creating a new travel request from Slack, go from Slack to Salesforce. But this one is the other way around, right? This one is you change something in Salesforce and you want that to be reflected on Slack. And for that, we have two options, okay? There is something that allows you to communicate directly to a Slack and post messages into a Slack. There is a feature called webhooks, okay? Webhooks support complex UIs built with BlockKit, for instance, and you can send requests to those webhooks, sending a custom UI that you have created. But in this case, webhooks were not valid because we wanted to check some more things in the logic of the Slack endpoint that we wanted to define. Okay, we wanted to check, for instance, for the authentication, because imagine that someone starts sending messages to a user that's not authorized, who has never authorized with Salesforce. It doesn't make sense that we start posting messages into that user Slack channel, right?
So if John Hoffman, who we just said no, they couldn't go to Madrid, but could go to Dublin, if they've never authenticated from the Slack app to their Salesforce org, we don't want the Salesforce org to be trying to notify the Slack app, hey, John, you've been approved or disapproved.
Exactly. Or for instance, if once they authenticated, but then time has passed and the authentication is not valid anymore, for instance, right? So for that reason, we decided to pick as another option to implement that incoming webhook, which are custom HTTP routes. Okay, so this is something that you can implement by yourself with Express, but Bolt, which is the framework that we are using to create this app, supports custom HTTP routes directly, right? If you want, you can open maybe the documentation to show in the page what I'm talking about.
Yep, I'm loading it now. Let's see here. That is the wrong one. This is the one I want. So we've got listening to messages and we're looking for custom routes.
There is a page which is defining custom HTTP routes.
Let's
let me see. I see it very small, so I'm not able to.
Yeah.
Maybe you can look for it. You can do a search, I believe.
I believe you're right. I just don't know where to do the search because getting started with HTTP. Nope.
Why don't you? If you I see it. So it's in advanced concepts, the last one.
There we go.
There we go. Exactly. So basically what you do with this is that you define an endpoint that is going to be accessible and that you can call out from the outside.
Okay.
So in this case, we define a message handler, and what we do is to call that endpoint posting messages from Salesforce.
Okay.
Okay.
So
do you want me to show
in our code
the code
here? Yeah. Let's look at the code here. Because I'm trying to figure out, it's not going to be in listeners.
Yeah.
It's going to be under
routes.
Oh, routes.
There is
okay.
a folder called routes.
Okay. And you want index or Salesforce message callback?
The Salesforce message callback.
Okay. There we go. And let's see here. I'm not seeing that same block where we've got a route set up. So how does this work?
So the way to set out the route, if you open the index, again, there is where we register all the custom routes. And if you open app.js, which is the entry point for the app, we are going to see how we register the routes.
Let's see here.
That we import from
register
that
listeners. Module. Register custom routes. Okay.
Exactly. So it's exactly the same than what we have in the documentation, but it's modularized, right? Divided in modules so that it's easier to maintain and to extend.
Yep, makes sense. And so this is our message handler.
Yeah, so this is the code that executes when that custom HTTP route endpoint is reached, because we have made a post request from Salesforce. We could do it from a different system, right? And there is where we check if the user is authenticated. Well, I think, let me see, because I don't remember the code by memory.
You mean you haven't memorized this?
Not really. Not really. Okay. So there is where we check on line 18, we check if the user for which the message is directed is authenticated with Salesforce. And then, depending on the type of message that we are receiving, because we are posting messages in 3 cases. We are posting messages if you are the owner of our request and it gets approved, if you are the owner of our request and it gets rejected, and also we are posting messages if you are the approver for our request and it's created. Someone creates a request for which you are the approver. So here is where we define, okay, this is our use case, and this is the message that we need to post to the user.
Okay. So we are, we've got some people tuning in. Got Eloy from Spain. Hello, Eloy. Got Keshav. Hello, Keshav. And Yusul. I just want to say hello to everyone who's tuning in. Thanks for tuning in. Feel free to ask your questions, comments, or Snyder marks here in the chat. We are working with Alba today on our Ready to Fly sample app. It's the not yet released, wait till next Thursday, version of our approval app that we built with our Salesforce Slack starter kit. We were just going over how we go from Salesforce back into our Slack app. So my question for you is, how do we actually, what is the mechanism by which Salesforce is posting that data to, so I changed this to approved. Is that a trigger or a workflow or a flow, or how's that going?
Yeah, I just created a trigger. You can maybe open the code to take a look at the trigger handler.
So let's see, if we look under the Force app classes, we can see or maybe it's going to be triggers, because you said it was a trigger. Travel request.
Yeah, it's the trigger uses a trigger handler, and in the trigger handler, we are calling a service that posts the messages in the cases that we want to post a message.
So we got our Slack service here, and maybe I'll click on it. How to use Slack in Lightning Web Components. John, that is an interesting question. Give me just a second to parse that here, but this is our Slack service. So we're going to grab our URL and post the message. Let's see, get our Bolt app URL. Is going to pull it from the metadata. I'm just running through this real quick.
Yeah, that's true. What I did was to use a custom metadata protected record. Sorry, not protected by regular, because that way we can, in the deploy script, when the Heroku app is created, we can deploy the Heroku URL in a custom metadata record, and we don't need to hard code anything. Everything works that way.
Yep. Okay, that makes sense. So we've got here, we've got a trigger that calls our trigger handler, which will result in the Slack service being called to post that message to Slack. It's going to grab the URL of our Bolt application that's running on Heroku and send the message to that custom route. And then our custom route takes over and passes that back into, if we go into back in here to our routes, to our Salesforce message. And that takes care of going, okay, well, this is a new message for you to review, or it's been approved, or it's been rejected, and then tell you, exactly what it is. And it's going to send that to our user ID, but it's using this underscore post message. Did we write that, or is that part of the Bolt SDK? It looks like we wrote it down here. Okay, so it's just calling it's a wrapper for the persisted client Bolt function. Okay, that makes sense. So we've gotten this.
Sorry, can I explain that for a second, because it's a complex concept. So what happens is that when when we define the listeners, right, we always have the listeners for Slack events, we always have the context and the client, because Slack sends that context and that client to our listeners or to our shortcuts, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when we define a custom HTTP route, let's say that Salesforce call out that we are doing loses track of which is our client or which is our context. And in this case, what we decided to do, really Mo did it, okay? Mo, who is brilliant, decided to create a singleton pattern. So what happens is that he assigns the client object to the singleton. The first time that the app loads, if you know that pattern, what happens is that it's going to that object is going to be shared among all instances of my application and among all the processes, right? And what is going to happen is that next time that process interacts or is executed, because we have received a callout from Salesforce, the client object is going to be there. Okay, that's the way that we solve it.
Gotcha. So we're using that singleton pattern, and that is our persisted client. And when we call this underscore post message, and I assume this is, so if you're not familiar with the underscore prefix to methods, that generally refers to something that is considered private or internal to this file, at least in languages I've used before. Is that the case in this situation, Alba?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. As in JavaScript, you don't have private or public.
Yeah, exactly.
This is the way that historically has been used.
Yep. So we're going to do underscore post message. So it's a private method here. We're going to call with the user ID and message. We're going to post that with the client that we've preserved as we go through. So that makes perfect sense to me, is how we're getting that there. And our handler, or the callback method for this, just takes that data that Salesforce is posting to the Bolt app, parses it a little bit, and then sends the appropriate message to the user. We could probably also generate this message on the Salesforce side and then just drop that in, just post that in whatever the Salesforce sends back. But I like the way this is breaking it down and doing a case statement. My favorite control flow statement in programming is the switch or case statement, and I don't think they get used often enough. So I'm happy to see that there.
I started doing it in Salesforce, but then I realized that I refactor it to just send always a message that contains which is the status to which the travel request is changing, who is the user ID to which we want to post the message, and I think something else. Oh, the instance URL.
Yep.
Because we need the instance URL to be able to create links in those messages. In the message, if you see the message that the app sent to you.
Yeah, and so if we look at this, where it says TR underscore or TR-005, that is, if you look at it and I hover over it, you'll see that it's got my Scratch.org URL in there. So when we say instance URL, in this case, that's the Salesforce org instance URL, not the Slack workspace instance URL. So it can be a little confusing there, but in this particular situation, we're talking about the Salesforce instance URL. Cool.
Yeah.
So what are other interactions with this app do we want to cover or go over how they work or how they're built? We've done Slack to Salesforce and Salesforce to Slack. I'm assuming that the actual approve or reject is similar to the modal where we type in the information.
Yeah, we can take a look at the approve or reject because it's different from the view that we from the modal use case that we saw at the beginning, right? Because in the modal is when you show a modal, then you interact with the model using the callback ID of that model, right? And when the user submits the model, then it's that callback ID, the thing that we need to register.
Okay.
But for the approve and reject buttons is slightly different. So one way to do that, let me open. Do you mind to follow me?
I'm following you, so you can go ahead and drive.
Oh, okay, perfect. Thank you. I'm not used to live share yet. I need to practice. So, for instance, one place in which we show those approval and request buttons is on the app home when you take a look at the pending travel requests to review. And that is this page here, okay? So this is the listener for when we open the app home and we navigate to the pending travel requests view. Here we are using this function here that I moved to a utils folder so that we can reuse it because we are using it in different moments, right? And what we are doing here is to build the authorization screen, which is defined in our UI folder, okay, app home. Sorry, not the authorization screen, the travel request screen is this one.
Okay.
But let's take a look at the travel request review screen, this one here. And here again, we are using BlockKit Builder and the NPM module that allows us to use BlockKit Builder in a more robust way, right? We are doing the same, but instead of linking the view to a callback ID, here what we are linking are the buttons that we append to that view. So you can link listeners at different levels. You can link a listener to the whole button that comes to the model, or you can link a listener to an individual button or an individual interactive element, which is the name for those kind of elements in Slack, individually, right? So, well, if you see here, this is divided in methods, but it's basically we are creating a home tab. We are adding some buttons to the header of the home tab, which are the ones that are going to allow us to change between my travel request or my pending travel request to review. Then we have the travel request to review header. Then we go over our pending travel request and we add a block for each pending travel request. And then we just return that block in JSON. So let's take a look at how do we create each individual block for approving or rejecting those travel requests. And this is the code, okay? In the code, we have a text, which is the text in which we indicate, hey, you are traveling from this place to this another place. These are the dates that you are traveling, etc., etc. It's just the summary. And then we add 3 buttons. And these are the buttons that are now linked to an action, not the whole homepage, the whole view, but this time is every individual button. So how do we link those buttons to their listeners? We define, for instance, for the view button, we have a view request listener, or for the reject button, reject request, or for the approve button, the approve request. And again, what we will need to do in this case is to define those listeners. Where do we define those listeners? In our listeners folders. And in this case, interactive events are going to be called actions. So if we take a look at the index file, we can see here that there is a listener that we are linking to the approve request action. There is another listener that we are linking to the request reject action, etc. Right?
Gotcha.
So
okay.
And it doesn't matter how many times you render that UI, that every time that you click on approve request, this listener is going to fire.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Okay.
That's why we are reusing the same code to show pending travel requests in the home tab, in the app home, sorry, that I discovered home tab and app home is different. So in the app home, but also in messages. So when someone creates a new travel request and you are the manager, you receive a message, which is a block that contains also these approve, reject, and view details buttons.
Gotcha. I like that. I like the modular approach. It takes a little bit of like rethinking around, because as a traditional Salesforce developer getting into this JavaScript and Bolt for Slack stuff, it's a little bit different way of thinking about modularity. It's not classes and that sort of thing. So if I have a blank look on my face, it's because I'm still processing all of this. But I like the way this is organized. I mean, it's intuitive. I just feel like I would have to double check a few things as I went along because I'm not as familiar with it. Now, we've got a couple of questions coming in from the chat. John wants to know how to use Slack and LWC, and I don't think we're there yet. Do you have opinions on that, Alba?
We are not there yet, but in some months we are releasing a new API that will allow you to interact with the Slack APIs directly from Salesforce. So I can imagine that if you are able to interact with Slack from Apex, you can easily create a Lightning Web component that calls that Apex and that through Apex performs actions on Slack. So
that's our, I think we still are calling it codename Foyer. That's the project that is currently called Foyer. I don't know if it'll still be called Foyer when it's released, but that is our sort of Apex API framework for interaction with Slack. And while you could do a lot of that stuff in the Bolt framework we're using today, when you use Foyer, it's going to take care of all the authentication. It's going to take care of a whole lot more of the stuff that you have to worry about right now and take care of it for you. And this is an important and, if you are an ISV who wants to build some sort of interaction between a Salesforce org and Slack, Foyer is going to be your only option. So heads up, okay? John, I hope that answers your question. You can't really do it today, at least not without a lot of work. You could build it on Bolt and have an Apex that calls out to a custom route in your Bolt app and do it that way, similar to the way we're doing sending the message back saying it's been approved or denied. But that's a lot of work, and Foyer will make that a lot simpler for you. And then the other question we're getting is from Yusel, who's saying, can some interaction from Slack back to Salesforce? And I don't know that I quite parsed that, Yusel, if you want to try asking your question again. He says, they say, thinking about, for example, use cases where customers can reply opening a case or something similar. And so it sounds like you're thinking of somebody who's in Slack, maybe a customer, who's then going to do something to open a case. And you could do that with the Bolt framework like we've shown here, but instead of an approval request, you're going to be calling and making a case. And what I really want to stress to you is that if you look here in our Salesforce directory, we've got this, aside from the server-to-server auth and the user-to-user auth, we've got things for DML like creating a travel request. And if we look at this travel request object, what it's doing is sending that with JSForce. And when you're using JSForce, you can interact with virtually every aspect of the Salesforce APIs that exist. I say virtually because I understand that there's a couple of outliers there that JSForce doesn't cover, but off the top of my head, I can't tell you what they are because everything I've tried to use in JSForce has worked. So you can definitely hit all your standard objects, custom objects, and so you could create a case right here from your like you could have a create case or create case comment, for instance, in order to surface those in Slack and allow people to write things back into the case comments or create a case. Does that make sense, Alba? You think I covered that?
Yeah. One thing that people may be confused with if they haven't watched the previous codeLives is how's the architecture of this app. So basically, this is something that confused me at the beginning a lot. So basically, you have to bear in mind that there is a Slack, right? And Slack has an API. Then in the middle, we have an app that we have built with Node.js in Heroku, and that we are running in Heroku. But this app could be written in Python, for instance, or Java. There are SDKs for those three different languages, and it could be running somewhere else. Okay, we run it in Heroku because for simplicity and to take advantage of the free capabilities and power of Heroku, we decided to do it that way, but it could be hosted somewhere else. And then we have Salesforce as well. So this app, the Node.js app, acts as a middleware. And the app is the one that's listening to the events that happen in Slack, and the one that is making requests to Salesforce to change things in Salesforce when we approve a request or when we create a request. And it's also acting as a middleware when we request things from Salesforce to Slack. When we post those messages that we want to post into the user's Slack channel, what we do is that we are really sending a post message to the custom HTTP route that we have created in that middleware app, okay? And that middleware app is the one that is communicating with the Slack API to change the UI of the Slack app or the Slack instance that we are working with, right? So this middleware app is the one that you create with Bolt. When we are talking about Bolt, is the framework that allows you to easily work with the Slack APIs. You could work with those APIs directly, right? But it's much easier to do that with Bolt. And this is the framework that I'm saying that we have different implementations in different languages, in Python, Java, and JavaScript, as far as I know. Hope that makes sense.
I'm trying to put something on the screen here to make it match. Built with BoltJS, which gives us I don't know why it keeps trying to save this here. BoltJS, which gives us easy access to you know what, I'm just gonna say it out loud. So we have this middleware app, and that middleware app was built with our Salesforce Slack starter kit, and that includes BoltJS and JS Force. BoltJS gives us easy access from our middleware app into Slack, and JS Force gives us easy access from our middleware app into Salesforce. So that middleware app is acting as the sort of middle ground that is able to talk easily back and forth between each one. Yeah, so we've got that set up there. Now, again, Foyer is coming, which will make this easier so you can do most of this stuff without that middleware. So you can go straight from Slack to Salesforce and back and vice versa. But right now we've got the Bolt app. We're doing it with Salesforce and this middleware. Let's see here. We got some other questions. Ucel says thank you. We've got Ross saying hello from hello to Indiana and Grenada. Let's see, we've got a couple other people saying hello, but then we've got Shashank asking, how do we resolve CPU time errors? Shashank, that's a great question. It's a little bit beyond our scope for the day, and so what I want to do is I want to give everyone else opportunity to ask if they've got questions about this scope, and then if no one does here in the next couple of minutes, then I'll give you some pointers on that one. But let's give time to anybody else asking questions of Alba and I about the actual Slack and Salesforce app we built here, ready to fly. Does anybody have great idea of what something they want to build as a Slack Salesforce integration? You know, our ready to fly, our travel approval app is sort of a it's a simplified enough use case that I think we can all see it being something useful, but also not being detailed enough for your company's needs. So does anybody have like, oh, I'm going to go build X, Y, and Z?
Something that I love, Kevin, is an integration that we have at the moment in our company, right? From which, if you request time, PTO time, or you have to log special time off for any reason, then you can do that from Slack, and your manager can also approve that time off from Slack. We have also that for expenses now, and we have also an integration with Google Calendar. So for us, Slack is becoming more and more useful each time, because you can almost do everything from Slack and you don't have to be navigating to each individual application every time. So that may give you some ideas of things that you could implement yourself as well.
Yeah, the other one I'll throw out there is we have this thing we call it Concierge, and it's the idea of it's like a help desk system. So, you know, if you forgot your password or something like that, you can go into Concierge and say, hey, I need help resetting my password. Or like if you need a power adapter or you know, a cable, you can ask for all those kinds of things in Concierge. And we've moved Concierge into Slack, so now I can go in and see all the things that I've requested and tickets and responses and interact and leave messages. And it makes it a lot easier because I can do it on my phone. So, you know, if I'm at my daughter's ballet class and she's off dancing, I get the notification that, you know, I've got a question for clarification from my Concierge ticket. I can just open up my phone and right there in Slack, and I love it. Let's see here. Yusel is saying, I'm thinking about some CI processes when deploying artifacts in MuleSoft managed inside of a Salesforce app. You want to pull that into Slack so that you can see some CI information whenever artifacts in MuleSoft are created or updated? I'm curious as to give you... Say more, Yusel. Let's do it that way. Say more. I want to see what exactly you're thinking here. We've got 2 minutes left. Well, Yusel is going to give us some more information on that. I'll talk back to Shashank here. CPU timeout errors. The best way to do that is to use the there's a plugin for Visual Studio Code, and it is the log. I have it installed. Let me filter by installed, and I'm going to do log analyzer, Apex log analyzer, and it's put out by Financial Force. And if you go to the look at this, they'll show you exactly how to use it, but it'll start showing you where your time is being spent inside of your Apex transaction. And so knowing where your time is spent, you can start to optimize the things that are taking the most amount of time. And that's typically how I start to track those down. Let's see here. So Yusel is saying maybe like code reviews open.
There is a GitHub integration that you can install in your Slack workspace, so that when you receive a pull request, for instance, that you have to review, you receive a notification, and you can track all the code review process and the workflow for that pull request or the code in general from within Slack.
Have we set that up for our org? I wasn't aware of that.
I have it set up for one of the repos I own.
Cool. That's really cool. I like that a lot. All right. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. Alba, thank you very much for joining me today and working through this. If you are playing along at home, you may have realized that I am still like wrapping my head around the organization and how all this stuff works. And Alba is one of our resident experts. So Alba, thank you very much for your time and your patience for dealing with me and figuring all this out. I appreciate it. We've got some great feedback coming in from people who are thinking it's a great session. So I'll pass that on to you, Alba. People really appreciated having you here. we'll see you again next week as we start. We're going to be doing more and more JavaScript over the next few months. So we're going to start off by doing a few sessions on preparing for the JavaScript certification exam. So if you don't know what that is, check out our certification exams on the Salesforce Developers website, and you'll be able to see what's covered and not covered in that JavaScript exam. We're going to work through learning and knowing enough JavaScript to pass that exam. So thank you very much. See you all next week.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.